This week's video is a lesson in trusting the process, turning foam pieces like this into a beautiful final end result. Welcome to the new studio. It is not as pretty as the old one, but this one is far more functional. It's still a work in progress. If I was to zoom out, you'd see that I am surrounded by trash in a garage. But this is where we're going to start, and this is going to be the centerpiece for the next leg of the Seb Makes Stuff journey. So let's jump into it. So my plan for this build is to make a cliff face. So we kind of want to have it come down, out, down again to give a very rough idea. So then our little dudes can move up the side of the mountain. This is to kind of mimic the idea that a very big mountain would have paths running the whole way around, or even switchbacks going back and forth up the mountain. They're not going to be super steep at any given point, but we are going to drag them out around the entire thing. So this way, this section can kind of represent any part of your mountain. Obviously along the front here, we want this to be a bit more jagged or irregular. Additionally, we can add some more bits and pieces coming out. So we want this to be as rocky and random as possible. Maybe even adding in a couple of little trees poking out. Look, I'm clearly not an artist, but this is kind of what I'm going for. So let's go over to the actual materials that I'm going to use and try and make this for real. We're starting with a large piece of XPS foam. For those of you here in Australia, you can usually get this at Bunnings. Otherwise, around the rest of the world, you could try hardware stores. It is, after all, a construction material for insulation of walls. Otherwise, hobby stores might have what you want. The other alternative is you could use packing foam. It isn't as good generally as XPS for carving details out of, but for today's purposes, we're kind of just wanting something to bulk out a shape that we can cover up with texture later on. So let's start cutting this down to the rough size we want and seeing how it turns out. So the first thing I want to consider is how big do I want this to be on my board? I'm kind of limited because we stream all of our games that I run or I play in over at Tomes and Tales RPG. So I need something big enough to give that idea of verticality that my players are moving along a cliff face, but still staying small enough that it won't completely block out the table and hide everyone behind the cameras. So to pick the measurements for my build, I'm gonna judge that based on this shelf that it's gonna end up living on. This shelf is from IKEA, so you can probably get one pretty much anywhere in the world. I don't remember the name of it, but I'll put that right here. So I got this for pretty cheap, and it's gonna live in the back of my office, so I'm keen to make my piece both usable but also a cool display for some of my minis. So we have 23 inches by just short of 9. I'm going to get out a nice sharp knife. Be careful when using sharp blades or working with any kind of chemicals or fumes. I know I'm not always the best at keeping up with it, but really, just be better than me and be careful.
Don't do what Donnie don't does. They could have made this clearer.
With that being said, I'm about to go use this knife, but I'm being careful, Dad, I promise. And using my metal ruler to hold everything in place.
Long, slow cuts.
A collection of small cuts is going to be a lot more effective on this kind of foam than trying to go one big cut. Okay, I got impatient with that. It's scored, so it broke off really evenly. That'll work perfectly. I'm actually pretty impressed with that. We now have our base piece. This is a good starting size. We need to bulk this up. And for that, we have scraps like these, all these bits and pieces that have been left over from old builds. To stick all this together, I'm just gonna be using a hot glue gun. So now we're just gonna start piling up trash, gluing it together, and giving ourselves a base to work with.
At this point, I decided to add a cave to the back of the build just to get a bit more use out of this piece.
You could just cut this bit out by hand, but I have a hot wire cutter, so I'm gonna approach this with that well, because I do. Pretty much everything in this build that I'm using this to cut out, you could just cut out with a knife. It's time for another safety notice. When cutting foam with a hot wire cutter, it lets off a lot of fumes, so make sure you're in a well-ventilated area and you wear the appropriate PPE, which should be a half-decent mask.
And while a knife does do the trick, there's something extra satisfying about the foam cutter.
Okay, so I got a little bit carried away there and I broke my piece, but this is a good opportunity to show you guys that nothing's too far gone, especially at this early stage. It all looks like a mess at this point, so any other bits and pieces that are broken are fine. We just want to make sure that when we put this back together, it's going to be solid. So we could just use some hot glue, but I'm going to go a little bit further and add a few pieces of wood sticking through the tooth. So probably just some bamboo skewers to just really hold this tight before we put some hot glue in there to make sure that our base piece stays nice and even. Now we want to stick our main backing pieces up. I want to do the same thing again and make these a bit more solid. So we're going to grab out a few more of these skewers, stab them into place. For now, we have a relatively stable piece. It's coming together.
I'll hack up a little bit of foam to give us a nice random topper for the cave and slide that into place.
Now we have our core shape. We want to bulk up this side here. So we've got our slant, pathway, cliff.
So I just start gluing down heaps of leftover bits of scrap to start producing the shape that I want.
Look, I know it looks like a bit of a mess right now, but you just got to trust the process.
So I try and take my own advice, trusting the process and just continuing to glue down more and more pieces to bulk out this rough shape. Then grabbing out the knife and the hot wire cutter and just roughing it all up to give us a more natural, rocky, earthy shape rather than something too clean. Essentially just going to town with the knife and making this as random as possible.
Alright, so we have a basic shape now. We've really carved in a nice random texture here. The back is still looking very flat and untouched, but we've got our shape of our cave carved in. And now I want to fill in all of these side bits and the extra bits and pieces. I could do this with foam, just packing in all of our little bits of extra mess, but what I'm going to use is expanding foam because I really like the random texture that it ends up leaving. It fills it in nicely. So I'm going to pop down to the hardware store now and pick that up, and then we'll get back to the next stage of this build. Alright, I'm back from the hardware store and I have my foam fill. It's time to bulk this build out. So essentially what we're going to do here is grab the foam, stick it into anywhere there's a little gap, and fill that up. This will expand a lot. So wherever you place it, you need to be ready that it's going to come out quite a bit more than you're expecting, but you can always cut that back later. This stuff sticks to your hand, so I'm going to grab some gloves.
Once I have most of the major cracks filled in, I'm just going to start spreading this out with my hands to just kind of cover as much as I can, and then leave that for the night to dry.
So that dried quite nicely last night. I forgot to film this part, but I also stuck down a few more little bits of scrap foam just to give us a bit more variation on that back wall and somewhere for our minis to stand and climb up the cliffs a little bit. Just trying to make it a little bit more random. So that's expanded out just a little bit more than we want, so we're going to grab out that knife and cut this down to be nice and flush. So at this point it's looking kind of weird, but as I keep saying, trust the process. This is the point of the build where it's about to start to transform and look like something real. We have our cliff side walkway on this side, and on the back here we have our cave. This side of the build is, you know, kind of average, but it just gives us that extra ability to get a bit more use out of this build, especially considering it's going to be taking up a bit of space. I know most people out there's problem with these bigger builds is the amount of space they take up and how often you get to use them. So something like this, having multiple uses just becomes that little bit more handy over the long run. Also, trying to do it as a display piece just gives me that extra use when it's not in play. But now, it's time to make this look a little bit more natural. We want to add a heap of rocks. For this, I'm going to be using my Woodland Scenics rock mold, but I'll show you another way to do the same kind of thing just using aluminium foil.
For this, we're going to be mixing plaster of Paris with a colorized grout compound. This just helps to make the plaster a little bit darker so that if anything snaps off down the line, you're not left with a pure white showing on your board. So once that's mixed up, we just pour it into our molds. But for those of you who don't want to go out and buy the molds, you can just crinkle up some foil and dump your plaster of Paris straight into here. This is what the rock molds come out looking like, really nice and natural, and I'm going to use a lot of these throughout this build, so we just keep on reproducing it. And this is the comparison straight out of the foil. The foil's not as good, but it's good enough for a cheaper alternative. Then we just start gluing a heap of these rocks randomly all over the front of our build. I'm using the Woodland Scenics rock molds for the front cliff face, and the cave wall in the back is going to get some of those aluminium foil rocks.
I personally don't like these quite as much, but I want to show the different types of things that you guys can make yourself. And after all, this side is kind of an afterthought compared to the rest of the build. Now it's time to texture everything up. For this, we're going to cover the entire thing in my homemade sculptor mold. I'll throw the link up here so you guys know how to make the recipe yourself. Essentially, it's just ground up toilet paper with some plaster of Paris. So I've got some that I prepared earlier. We're going to mix this up now and just start smearing it over everything.
I'm taking a cup, some PVA glue and some water and mixing it all up nicely. I'll also be adding in some brown paint. You can use any color you want, but I want there to be a nice brown base so that if any of my painting down the line peels or breaks away, it leaves us with a nice earthy looking base underneath. Once I've covered up most of my build, that needs some time to cure.
That has had a night to dry and everything has come out looking great. Now it's time to seal the entire thing up with a Mod Podge and paint mix, just to make sure that none of the foam is exposed for when we go to paint this guy. This is very important because if you hit any of this with an aerosol can and the foam is exposed, it's going to melt away. And there's nothing more annoying at this stage of the build than having all of that just eaten away and destroy what you've worked on. So I'm going to mix this Mod Podge up with some brown paint and hit all of the areas that I can see foam poking through the sculptor mold.
Even though I'm going to paint over all of this, I'm mixing that brown paint in there just so that if any paint does miss spots or if we kind of had things chip away later on, there's still going to be a good coverage and it's going to look nice and natural, rather than letting through the colors of our base work, whether that be the white of the foam or anything else you've used. Then, once it's covered, we need to let it dry.
Approximately 10 hours later.
That has come together looking really nice. It's a little bit glossier than we would like, but we're now going to take that outside and give the entire thing a paint in a grey primer. I'm just using a cheap grey spray paint that I get from my local hardware store. I love this stuff and it does a really good job at coverage and making sure that anything else sticks. I'm then coming in with a few different greys and blacks and whites just to give us some more variety.
So I've taken this outside, given it a good coat of paint, and honestly, I'm really not loving the way it looks. I had to hit it with a few different layers and really try and pile it on, and I'm just seeing now so many better ways I could have approached it. But I'm going to push through that and hope that, as I keep saying to you guys, if I trust the process and just pivot where things don't work and try something new and just keep experimenting as I'm going, then I'll end up with something I like. So in saying that, we're going to dry brush this entire thing and then move on to adding a little bit more earthy, natural textures.
For this dry brushing, I'm using the cheapest acrylic paint I could find. I've got a grey, a black and a white so I can mix up the colours a little bit. I'm putting a tiny bit on the end of a cheap house painting brush and just rubbing this lightly over my build to pick up all the highlights.
Dry brushing that has given it a massive improvement, but I don't want this to all just be one colour. If I want this to look like a mountain that, has a path built into it, whether that's natural or man-made, you can decide. I want some variation. So I like to think that there'd be a bit of dirt caught up on all of these flat surfaces. We want some more dirt and mud in the sides and things growing out of this to make it feel more alive. So I'm going to do some more browns and dirt effects and try and bring this to life. And for that, I'm using this bag of dirt. This is literally dirt and gravel that I scooped up off the road right outside of my gym.
I probably looked like a weirdo to anyone that was watching me scoop dirt out of the gutter, but hey, we can't live our life based on what other people think, right? Speaking of other people, everyone will probably mention that you should probably sterilize this dirt before using it, but I'm lazy. Then I'm just spreading out my PVA glue over all the flat surfaces or anywhere that I want my dirt to gather and just start spreading my dirt.
And now, since my dirt has a lot of large rocks in it as well, I want to kind of separate out the smaller stuff first. So I'm going to be taking a strainer. This is a tea strainer, but you could use any kind of sieve, and just giving that a shake, giving us a nice thin layer and hopefully keeping most of those bigger rocks off the main walkway. This will just help our miniatures to be able to sit solidly. Now, you could do this stage before painting, but I really like the effect of natural rocks and some different colors mixed in, rather than it all being painted up to match.
Now I'm going to soak this very heavily with 100% isopropyl alcohol and mix in some watered down Mod Podge. The alcohol will soak into everything and help the glue and water mix spread evenly throughout all of our dirt. I may have overdone it just a little bit, so I did put another layer of dirt on top. Now, this dirt wouldn't just be sitting in this one space, so I'm going to flip it onto its back and add chunks of dirt all over our cliff. And that's looking really nice. And once again, we leave it to dry.
The following day.
Right now, this is arguably good enough to play on. You could throw some minis down and you'd have a perfectly acceptable piece of terrain. But because I want mine to be a display piece, I want this to look a lot more lush and overgrown and green, as I tend to do. So we're going to add some trees and some foliage and really just bring this to life.
So first thing we're going to do is build a heap of trees. You've probably seen this done before. In fact, I did it in my previous video where I'm using the encounter terrain method of just twisting up a heap of pipe cleaners and then melting down the fuzz with a lighter to make a really nice bark. You should be wearing a mask while doing this. There are a lot of fumes and it's plastic, so just be careful. Also, be careful with fire. Obviously, just be careful with pretty much everything you do. Make sure you're doing it properly. Once that's done, we're left with a really nice fantasy tree with these beautiful sprawling roots that we can bend into shape wherever we want. So I'm going to repeat that process a few more times to give us some more, and then forget to film myself hitting them with a brown spray paint. My bad. Back on track. Let's take this plain looking mountainside and bring it to life. For this, we're going to be using a heap of different static grasses that I got off Amazon and from hobby shops and different places. I like to combine a heap of different ones of these into my static grass applicator and then use matte Mod Podge to stick it down. I blotch this over everywhere that I want the grass to be growing and then just start shaking it out of the applicator. I particularly like using the matte Mod Podge because when it dries, it doesn't leave that glossy sheen that you get from glues. So we put the metal tip of the applicator down and just start shaking our grass out of the static grass applicator. This causes it all just to stick out and keeps it looking nice and natural. You don't need this 100%, but I have it, so I'm going to use it. I then collect up any bits and pieces that have spilled and sort of just press them into the cliff faces, making sure to cover up all of these little bits and pieces and make it look like the grass is growing out of the cliff face. Now, we can see a heap of glue poking through there. What I like to do here is grab out some foam flocking, some really thin stuff, and just pour that all over top. A lot of this won't stick down, but what does fills in those gaps and gives a nice bit more range and variety to the colours of the grasses. Now, what didn't stick down, we can add on as mosses growing up the sides of the cliff face. So we sit it on its back, add some glue and just start dropping this in place. For this sort of mossy vibe, I really like doing different colors. So I have a handful of different brightnesses and colors for the foam flocking, and I'm going to grab this out and just start mixing them up on our piece. Once we're done with this, we tip out anything that doesn't stick, gather it up and save that for the future. That'll come in handy for our trees. Speaking of our trees, it's time to grab out our base foliage. I'm going to be using this foam moss from Amazon. It's essentially a heap of just tangled up thread. I cut out some adequately sized pieces and just start gluing them to the tops of our trees. I did some with super glue, this kind of stuck to my hands a lot, and I ended up doing a lot more of these with spray adhesive as I went. I found it a lot easier to work with. But this stuff kind of just sticks and tangles and builds out a really nice base for the tops of our trees. Then to add a little bit more detail, I threw these into a box, grabbed out the quick grip spray adhesive and gave them a blast. This will help them hold together by themselves, but also then we can give them a sprinkle with those different foliage and flocks that we've kept from previous builds or even the same ones we used earlier. And this will just stick now to all of that foam moss and give us a really nice, small, detailed foliage look that is gonna match and line up a bit nicer with the scale that we're working at. Then we grab out the hot glue gun and start sticking these to our cliff face. One of the best parts about this style of trees is you can bend them and reshape them as you go, which really helped me to line them up to fit nicely against the walls of our cliff, while also being able to kind of bend the tree to face upwards, like something that's trying to poke up and reach for the sun. I decided to try a different style. Instead of using the flocking for the top, I used these tiny little leaves that I bought on Temu, and they looked great. But the best part about this is it meant that I could then grab a few more of the little leaves and glue them around the base just below that tree, making it look like these leaves have fallen and gathered in the corners of our crevices. It's these tiny little details that I really love on builds like this, so it was a lot of fun being able to play around with something new. And then gave them a spray with isopropyl alcohol and a 50-50 mix of Mod Podge and water. I then went around applying this to all of my trees just to make sure that all that flocking stayed nice and solid and didn't fall off as we went. At this point my hot glue was dry and it revealed that it kind of ruined the effect. So I grabbed out some of that dirt from earlier and mixed up a Mod Podge and dirt mix, basically a weird natural concrete, and spread this out over all of our root systems to cover up that hot glue that dries to look just unnatural and weird. But this also helped to kind of blend everything into the wall.
At this point, I've basically given up on my cave on the back. It's there if I ever need it, but I wasn't loving the process, so I've kind of just put that aside and really focused on our front piece. So while this is more than good enough for most tables and display situations, I want to take this to the next level. So I'm going to grab out a heap of grass tufts and clump foliage to add some bushes. I might add a couple more trees and then get some flowers and possibly some 3D printed little mushrooms and critters just to add some extra details to this piece.
This is my favorite part of any build. I find it so therapeutic and relaxing, just going around with all these little tufts and adding them into the corners and crevices and making the piece look beautiful and lived in and alive. I slowly am learning not to add as many as I have in some builds in the past. Sometimes less is more, but I'm also a bit of a fiend for more is more. So I just kept going. I will say that I've built up my collection of plants and tufts and added bits and pieces over years in the hobby, so don't need to rush out and get all of these right away. But I love it and I'm never going to stop growing this collection. At this point I decided to add a couple more trees, so I followed the process I did earlier and made up a couple more varieties of trees, this time using different flockings and coloured bits and pieces and some more of those tiny little timu leaves to give us more of that variety of plants that we can have dropping bits and pieces on our pathway. In my experience, variety is the key to really making a natural build look lived in and real. And it's kind of my vibe to just go overboard with this kind of thing. So we're going to sprinkle some of those same colours and leaves down that were used in the trees just underneath them, like they're dropping petals or flowers. Spraying that with the isopropyl again and hitting it once again with the 50-50 mix of Mod Podge and water. This is just to really help everything hold in place as it's going to get played on and we don't want to lose bits and pieces as we go. At this point we are 100% good enough for any gaming table, but I want to go back in and throw in all those tiny little 3D printed frogs and mushrooms and bits and pieces that I've printed out from Thingiverse. Let's get painting up all those tiny little bits and pieces and sticking them in place. First things first, I'm going to paint up some of these tiny little birds. I haven't used these enough in the past, but I think they're perfect for a cliff face. But if we've got birds, we need a nest. So I'm going to grab out some of these tiny little cotton buds, tear them away till we've got just a small amount left, and soak them in some Mod Podge. Once it starts to dry just a little bit, I start shaping it up and sort of pressing it into that rough shape of a bird's nest. It's far from perfect, but bird's nests are a natural thing, so they're going to work just fine. Once the Mod Podge is dry, I stain it up with a brown contrast paint. This soaks in really nicely to that dried cotton bud and make sure it's shaped properly. Then once that paint has dried, I'm going to come in and dry brush it with a little bit of towelite ochre to give it some highlights and variation. And now it's time to glue it in place in one of our trees and then add in a couple of little bluebirds to occupy the new nest. I loved this one so much that I did it again to place in one of the other spaces because in my opinion there's never enough tiny little details on a build. Once I had this one though, I decided to add something a little bit different. There's a predator in the bush. All of these tiny little bits and pieces are 3D resin prints. The models are available for free on Thingiverse under Pellinor 1. I will link it in the description. These are some of my favorite 3D prints and probably the most used thing I have ever printed. I absolutely love these. They show up in so many of my builds and will continue to do so. basically forever going forward. As you can see, I kind of print tons of these at once and mass paint them so I've got them ready for builds in the future. Then I just go around gluing them all in place wherever I feel like they would make sense. Adding a few mushrooms here and there in the crevices of the rocks or the roots of the trees, and a handful of little critters and creatures to bring a little bit of life to this environment. Just to add that extra little bit of something that my players can notice when they're looking at this piece, or anyone looking at the display on the shelf will just be able to keep finding tiny little extra details that makes it so this build has something special every time you look at it.
And with those final bits and pieces of tiny details on there, I can call this build done. As I said, this was a big test in trusting the process because there are a lot of stages throughout this that I really wasn't happy with how it was looking. But we hit that point where it started to transform and come to life, and now I am stoked with the end result that I've got. I may have kind of given up on this back piece. I still have it if I want to use it, but really the main focus for me in the end was this front display. This is what's going to show on the shelves, and this is the main piece that I'm going to use in my game. I really went overboard on the colors and foliage and plants, as I tend to do, which doesn't exactly fit the world that I'm going to be playing in, but I wanted this to be a display piece more than anything. And since it's only going to get used in probably 1 or 2 games, whereas this is going to sit on my shelf forever, that was my priority. And now I get to go see how it looks on the shelf.
And that fits perfectly. The lights aren't brilliant. As you can see, they sort of trigger my camera as well, so I might swap these out, but I have this perfect fit, and now I get to throw some minis up there and have a cool little display showing my party fighting some weird bug creatures.
So I'm not super stoked with these particular lights, but they kind of serve the purpose for now. I will be replacing them with something a little bit brighter and more natural looking because these colors kind of look a little bit weird. But there we have a display piece that fits perfectly into these IKEA shelves. That is going to be the start of a bigger project where I try and fill up the rest of this shelf with other builds. I am stoked with my end result in spite of many times throughout the build really not being so happy with it. It was really just a lesson in sticking to it, pushing through, pivoting where you need to, but trusting the process and knowing that once you get past that ugly, boring stage, it really just bursts to life. So this is a lesson I'm going to need to take forward into my next section of builds because I have a lot of big things planned going forward, and I'm sure a lot of them are gonna feel just not quite right at that halfway point, but then at the end they come together to give me something I'm proud of. The encounter terrain style of trees works perfectly, being able to bend them up and really shape them so well. I could have taken this to the next level and really hot glued and painted to give them more texture in the bark, but they serve their purpose. Additionally, having them on here is great because if my minis are walking along here and get knocked off in combat, there's something for them to land on, giving us multiple levels to really play out this encounter. I'm stoked to have this awesome display piece and a build that's going to be a lot of fun to throw down on the table. All of these tiny little details, the trees and the life in it were so much fun to make, but also it was cool to just experiment with a few different new things like the tiny little leaves and the petals falling all over the pathway. I'm looking forward to getting this on the game table, but also having it as a beautiful start to my display shelf. Also, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you out there for getting this channel past 20,000 subscribers. I'm absolutely blown away with the success of the last few videos and how much growth this channel has seen in the past 2.5 years since I started. When I look back to myself starting this channel, we were in a whole different ballgame of just making some fun stuff for my home game, and somehow that's turned into me being able to craft and share this hobby with so many of you out there. I hope you guys keep letting me know what you want to see more of and that I can keep creating things that inspire you to do builds of your own. Nothing is more inspiring to me than hearing the comments of you guys trying these yourselves, hearing your ideas of different ways you'd approach it, or even better yet, seeing the builds that you guys have done inspired by my channel. It's what keeps me going, and thank you so much for the support and watching of my channel. I hope that I can keep encouraging and inspiring you guys to build things of your own, or even if you just enjoy watching me, thanks for sticking through, especially on these long ones. And until next time, never stop making stuff.
And now for something a little extra special. When I hit that 20k number, I was in the middle of a Tomes and Tales podcast game. So here's mine and my crew's reaction.
20,000 subs! He's the best.
I'm not gonna buy us a cake at lunch. So once again, thank you to everyone who subscribed, and here's to a future with a lot more crafting.